All right, this will be our second lesson for the unit on ancient Egypt. I meant to have this actually as part of this part as lesson 1, but I realized the video was going a little bit long, and I just wanted to keep it to kind of those 15 minutes without just going way over. And I don't think this video will be that long. At least I say that now, and we're 20 seconds into it. But if you remember, the last thing we're talking about is this idea where communities along the Nile started coalescing together until they came into two major kingdoms. We call the Kingdom of Upper Egypt and the Kingdom of Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt being north on the delta, and Upper Egypt being south in the Nile River Valley. Upper Egypt being there in the red, Lower Egypt in the green. Although whoever made that line right there, the cutoff would be more like right in that area, if you're seeing that. Anyways, not a big deal. Moving on. We're going to get back to talking about what happens between those two kingdoms, like who wins over who, and like what we think was the reasoning behind it and things like that later. But right now we're going to focus more on just kind of Egyptian life and society once they get to that point. As you're looking at this, you're seeing the social class system of ancient Egypt. And it's not too far off from what most civilizations are. You have your political leader at the top. A lot of times your priests and priestesses would be either on the same level as the leader, or the leader is a priest himself, like a high priest of himself in some way, shape, or form. But usually religious officials are always pretty high up. Hardly do you ever see a civilization where they're low. Then you get the nobles, the people that kind of control the land. Noble birth, that whole thing. They're seen as higher up than everybody else. Then you pretty much just have everybody else. What today we'd call kind of like the middle class and lower class peoples. And this is where things can get very varied. But there's one thing I would like to point out that's a little bit different than the rest of it. Like, if you remember in the last video, I kept talking about how easy farming was for the Egyptians. Well, because it was so easy, the farmers really weren't held as such high esteem. Yes, you have nobles who own tons of swaths of the land, but usually a farmer, especially if a farmer owns a small portion of their own area, they'd be up there with sometimes the nobles. In some civilizations, up there with the priests and priestesses, because they're viewed as someone who just provides society with what they need to survive. But they're definitely there with the merchants, scribes, and artisans. And in fact, a lot of civilizations, especially in China, when we get there, merchants are actually viewed as the very, very bottom. Like, to be a slave was better than being a merchant. It was better than being a merchant. Anyways, get a little off base again, but please don't think about that in Egypt. I was talking about China just a second ago. But in Egypt, farmers were just not held in as much esteem. These aren't farmers who are slaves working a farm. These are farmers who, that's their job. That's how they contribute to society. And yet, because their job seemed so easy on the Nile River, they just weren't as looked at as important as, well, others. So I like to point that out. Do get this down. If you need to pause this, feel free to get this down. But I'll move on at this. I'll move on. Now, hieroglyphs. This is one of those things where I'm really hoping you know about hieroglyphs. You learned about it in elementary school, you learned about it in junior high, and now you're in the class in high school talking about it. It's like, yes, Mr. Harrison, I've heard of hieroglyphs many times before. I'm hoping that's everybody hearing me right now. The only thing I'd like to add to this is, we know that hieroglyphs are a pictographic writing. You're writing through basically a bunch of symbols representing stuff, and I have an example of hieroglyphs right there in the picture. But what I'd like to focus on is where it says glyphs could represent objects, ideas, and sounds. So basically in early forms of writing, you had to make a symbol for everything, which is nice. Like, what's the sound that a bird chirp makes? What's the taste of honey? What does it sound like to have a hammer hit, whatever you're making on the anvil, bronze sword, iron sword, whatever, or whatever tool you're creating. Like, what's the sound? You have to make like in hieroglyphic, you have to make a symbol for that. It's hard to describe it. And this is one of the reasons why pictographic languages, we don't see as many of them around, is because you don't have, it's less simple than, say, a phonetic language like English or anything with an alphabet, basically. And it's hard to describe things as well. So, anyways, I just wanted to focus on that a little bit because I'm fairly sure most of us really haven't looked at hieroglyphs in that way. We usually just think, oh, that's how the Egyptians wrote, and it looks kind of cool. But you understand that what I'm trying to explain is one of the reasons why hieroglyphics are not really around anymore as a functional language. Now, there's definitely other reasons. So you talk about like the dominance of Rome and Greece and things like that, and conquering Egypt. But that aside, this is one big reason why we just don't see pictographic languages as much anymore. So, that being said, I like to point this out because I know everybody did this in elementary school. It's actually a great assignment, a good exercise to do. It helps introduce you to just the idea of ancient languages, ancient Egypt, the idea that there's other languages out there, and there's this idea that you can translate between the two. That's all good. But the whole concept, there was an actual alphabet with A, B, C, D, E back in Egyptian times. Well, like ancient Egyptian times, that's just not the case. Now, again, another thing that I feel obligated to need to talk about and teach about, and that is papyrus. Although I'm assuming most of you know about this at this point again, but if you don't, hey, great. But papyrus is the type of writing material or parchment that the Egyptians used to write their material stuff or their stuff on. I mean, I have a couple examples here, both of artwork and of writing. And what's awesome about papyrus, like, well, I find quite interesting, it's definitely proved as one of the more long-lasting, durable type of parchments or writing materials that we've seen in human history. You know, the paper we use today, you know, just like a notebook type stuff, like 100 years from now, that's crumbling. If that's put out to the elements, that's crumbling. Not to say papyrus wouldn't crumble if it's really out there in the elements, but it stands a better chance of surviving than paper does. And another thing a lot of times, like I'm comparing papyrus to paper, and that's a good comparison to make, but just know papyrus is not paper. It's made out of what's called the papyrus plant, and I show you a good picture of like a larger one, at least from a little further away, and then a picture of the reeds that they would use, and then the system of what they would use to basically make papyrus, where they just kind of make these grids, lay them down lengthwise and then crosswise, put a little sticky substance on it, and you just mash it together. I imagine you let it dry out at that point, but then you have your papyrus. That's how they make it. So it's a little bit of a painstaking process to make it, but definitely well worth it. Now, that being said, if I go back to this one, just take a look at those. I hope you can see that all right, whatever screen you're using. And if you notice, there is a crisscross pattern to each one of those. Feel free to pause it if you'd like, but I'm going to move on. Now, one thing I'm dang positive none of you have been taught just yet is that there are actually two other forms of writing you get in ancient Egypt. Not that they came around all at the same time, but this is where I like to talk about the concept that the power of reading and writing, well, it's just that. It's powerful. It's very powerful. If you know how to read and write and someone else doesn't, and you have something to read, well, they're completely reliant on you in telling them what it says. You could lie, and they would be completely reliant on you on what it says. Like one of the examples I really like to use is not from ancient Egypt, so just understand I'm giving you an example from medieval times, but the medieval church pretty much held a monopoly on who can read and who could write at the times. And in fact, in many areas of Europe, they made it illegal to learn how to read and write without the permission of the church. What this did is that you could have a church official say, well, the Bible says this, or this religious text or this person said this, and I have it right here, it says it right here, but because no one else can read or write, they just have to take your word for it. That, especially in a religious sense, is major power. And you have that same thing here with the Egyptian writing. The hieratic, I think I'm saying that right. You can correct me later in whatever comments you have on this. Used for religious texts, that was just between the priests and priestesses. That's just something that they knew how to read and write. They could communicate with each other, but they knew that no one else could really get in on what they were doing. Same thing with Demotic. That was for, well, it says legal documents, but basically the king and then later the pharaohs and their servants, scribes and whatnot, they would know how to read this, but no one else could, so they can kind of keep those secrets safe. And people just have to say, well, I guess it says that because I was told it says that. And again, that's a way to kind of keep power. Now, most people knew how to read hieroglyphic from what I understand, but not these two. So, the last thing we're going to go into in this lesson is how we even know how to read any of those language, whether it be Demotic, hieratic, or the hieroglyphs themselves. And that comes down to the Rosetta Stone. Now, the Rosetta Stone, I got a lot of pictures of it here. This is a big deal. In your notes, please have down, this is considered one of the most, if not the most important discovery to understanding or knowing our history, because it literally opened the door to understanding and reading the past. And over the course of time, the ability to read hieroglyphs, cuneiform, things like that was completely lost. So you have all these tablets and clay tablets and stone statues, whatever statues around, buildings that just have all these writings on them, and no one really knew how to read them because that knowledge was lost until you get to the stone. This stone was discovered in the late 1700s in Egypt. It was actually discovered by Napoleon's French army as they were battling the British and the Ottomans across northern Egypt for control. Napoleon Bonaparte, that is. And Napoleon Bonaparte actually was pretty big into history, and one of the things he told his men is, if you find anything of which you think is of significant historical value, you need to bring it to me. If not, there were going to be consequences. So there was, I believe it was 3 French soldiers went to go dismantle a nearby village so the French could build up some fortifications themselves. Now, that happens a lot throughout history. But in doing so, as they were taking apart one of the houses or edifices that they were disassembling, they found this stone where there was a bunch of writing on it. So they figured, well, I guess we better show this before we just put it into our fort. Napoleon sees that, and I imagine, at least the way I hear about it or read about it, it seems like he geeked out a bit. And of course, the historians and archaeologists he brought with him really geeked out over this. And I'm not really sure if they understood what they had. But over the course of the next 50 years, both French and then later English, I don't know what you call them this morning. My mind is going by basically English and French scholars start looking at the Rosetta Stone and realizing, wait a second, this says the same thing in 3 different languages, and we know how to read one of them. We still know how to read ancient Greek, which I believe the ancient Greek's on the very bottom. Then you have Demotic, I believe, in the middle, and then hieroglyphic on the top. And so since then, we've been through this constant process of trying to learn what different symbols mean based off of the Rosetta Stone. And then there's been other discoveries made too that they can compare to this, but it all started with this stone. This stone is what enabled us to start reading the languages of the past, especially hieroglyphic, and then even cuneiform from Mesopotamia. So again, one more time, considered one of the most important, if not the most important discovery to understanding the past is the Rosetta Stone. And with that, I'm going to end this lesson, and we'll actually start up into the actual history of ancient Egypt, with the different kingdoms, with the pyramid building, wars and civil wars and things like that in the next lesson. All right.